Occupation Education. As you know, this week we are covering Economics 101, and to cover what is normally covered in many years of education, we're going to do in one night tonight. We've got Jamil Jonah, our own Occupy organizer, who is currently working on his PhD in global economics or political economy. And with him will be his mentor and professor at the U of O, Professor John Bellamy Foster, who teaches in the sociology department and is an author of many books and probably considered an expert in this area. So we are very, very privileged to have two great brains try to translate kind of a foreign language, at least to me. All you have to do is listen to the radio or listen to TV, and they throw out words like the unemployment rate or GNP or all these different alphabet soups that actually mean things that are different than what we might actually understand them to be. So tonight the idea is to put some vocabulary and some concepts and some understanding into our toolkit to enable us to talk to our neighbors and talk to others coherently about a lot of the core issues that the Occupy movement is attempting to address. And so with that, I am going to turn it over to Jamil and John.
As we've been mentioning, this occupation education series kind of started off a little bit unexpectedly, having this pretty intense discussion about strategic campaign plans. And I just quickly wanted to point out that that is one of the main goals of the strategic campaign plan, is actually to build our movement, to bring people to the periphery, to develop some kind of campaign or set of actions that has a focus, not necessarily on winning the goals. We do want to have good short-term goals to win, but the idea is to be doing several different things at the same time. To build up our knowledge and understanding about a particular issue, to get some solidarity about that issue, to really understand it well, to be able to explain it to community members, to go out and organize in those communities, in the process of doing actions, to actually bring people into the fold, into Occupy Eugene, and explain why it's so important and why it's so dire. Everybody knows that our economy, as I'm about to explain in this presentation, is not doing well. There's going to be more, if people feel like they're in a desperate situation and that's why they're here, there's going to be more people like that. And it's wonderful, as I'm sure all of you know, to have that outlet and to be able to share in the struggle with other people, because it's just not getting any better. And unfortunately, I don't have any good news on that score as I go into this. So that's the main thing that I wanted to point out about the strategic campaign plans. It's not about this organization picking one specific issue, picking a single goal, restricting ourselves. It's about really trying to think about what kind of issue can we approach and develop and kind of target that will help several different aspects, really accomplish several different things that we all know are important to accomplish. So on that note, this is something that I've really wanted to discuss with people in Occupy Eugene for a while now, because I happen to think, I study economics, but I came upon the study of economics as an activist that was disenchanted with the way that a lot of other activists were kind of handling these questions. I felt that we were really weak. I felt that we were unable to, sort of fight some of the propaganda that you typically hear about the economy, about what's wrong with it, because frankly, a lot of the explanations that you'll hear from mainstream economics tend to blame us. They tend to blame people for the condition that they're in, whether you're unemployed, whether your house has been foreclosed on, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It has this bias, and I'm going to try to get into why I think that bias exists. So why should we learn economics? I was just reading this book today. It's a really great book. It's called Economics for the Rest of Us. This is one of many books that's come out that's really kind of attacked the bases of neoclassical economics and mainstream economics. And some of them are actually economists themselves. And they're really disenchanted because they realize that a lot of what is being taught and what is being sort of proffered in the media is not only false, it's highly ideological. And a lot of it is designed to confuse or to at least disguise some of the real problems and weaknesses of the economy and where the issues actually come from. So I just wanted to read this quote from John Bates Clark. This is not something that we really think about when we think about economics. Like the most basic aspects of production that are actually still debated and still very much an issue. And it seems really complicated. You hear about models, you hear complicated explanations about why X or Y is happening, but there's actually a lot of disagreement on the real basics. And so when the Haymarket protests were happening, the Haymarket massacre, what you had going on was a very similar situation to now. There was a stagnating economy, there was mass unemployment, there was lots of disgruntled people out on the streets trying to fight for an 8-hour workday. That was the main goal at the time. There was a huge demonstration that happened. The police reacted violently. They killed 6 protesters. The next day.
When was that, Jamil?
This is the Haymarket. This is around
1903 or?
Yeah, it's right around the turn of the century.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, it's 1886.
In Boston? It's in Boston.
No, Chicago.
Chicago, not Boston yet. Sorry,
sorry.
Chicago. So 6 protesters killed. The next day, there was another big demonstration, another conflict. A bomb was thrown. 1 officer was killed, another officer was injured, or a couple of other officers were injured. 8 labor leaders were taken into custody and given the death sentence. 4 were hanged. This is a huge, obviously, a huge event in U.S. history. And there was a really famous economist, John Bates Clark, that was commenting on, at this time, with this incident in mind. And this is what he said. He said, "The welfare of the laboring classes depends on whether they get much or little. But their attitude toward other classes, and therefore the stability of the social state, depends chiefly on the question whether the amount that they get, be it large or small, is what they produce. If they create a small amount of wealth and get the whole of it, they may not seek to revolutionize society. But if it were to appear that they produce an ample amount and get only a part of it, many of them will become revolutionists, and all would have the right to do so. The indictment that hangs over society is that of exploiting labor. Workmen, it is said, are regularly robbed of what they produce. This is done within the forms of law and by the natural working of competition. If this charge were proved, every right-minded man should become a socialist, and his zeal in transforming the industrial system would then measure and express his sense of justice. If we are to test this charge, however, we must enter the realm of production. We must resolve the product of social industry into its component elements in order to see whether the natural effect of competition is or is not to give to each producer the amount of wealth that he specifically brings into existence." This is a really fundamental question. It's saying, I work for someone and, I get a certain wage. Is that wage actually the result of all the work that I'm doing, or is a portion of it the profit actually coming from extra labor that I put in? You don't really see in a wage. This is disguised. I'm not going to go into the details of it. This is just a really basic, this is actually a core question of economics, not one that's answered, not one that anyone actually has an answer to yet. I believe that's still highly debated. So that alone, just to get a context, is a reason why we really need to understand economics, understand how fundamental this is. And it's really not just about economics, of course, right? If anyone, a sane person, were to look at that question, they would say, well, there's lots of different things going on there. It's not just about, producing a widget to send off to a different place. It's about power. It's about the right to unionize. It's about, who's in the positions of intellectual power to be able to say what is actually going on. And of course, John Bates Clark, what he's saying is, we have to go into this question scientifically and try to explain it and try to, prove that, you shouldn't be a revolutionary socialist, right? You shouldn't do that because that's not actually what's happening. So there's clear implications, there's political implications really to a lot of economics. It's hidden often because they basically try to restrict the focus of what they're studying and say that it's solely objective. And so that comes through time and time again. So what I thought I would do is give you sort of a different perspective than you might normally get on what's actually happening in the economy. Typically, the 2008-2007 financial crisis, we talk about the proximate causes. We'll say, this is obviously the result of the chicanery of the financiers. They're too powerful. There was predatory lending, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But if you take a longer-term view on what's been going on in the U.S. economy, it's pretty disturbing, and it gives you a very different perspective on things. And this is exactly the kind of perspective I think that we, as activists, need to understand, because we need to be able to take this debate directly to people that we don't normally challenge, right? We normally talk about social issues in kind of like a very, I would say, restricted way. We don't necessarily address them at their roots. So a lot of this comes from my dissertation research, which is on mass unemployment. So I'm going to throw some graphs at you. Try not to focus on all the sources and stuff. I'm just going to quickly explain them. All these dots represent the percentage of unemployed people. This is the official measure of unemployment. A lot of economists say that there's a natural rate of unemployment that we just have to have, that you can't have full employment, which is not actually true, but that's what they say. They're about this level. But you can see, this is the trend of unemployment right now. And you can see these huge spikes, of course, at recessions. So even by the official measure, and the reason I say official is because, there's some legitimate reasons to measure unemployment the way that it's measured, but there's also a lot of really big questions, especially now, because a lot of people are withdrawing from the quote-unquote labor force, meaning they haven't looked for a job in a certain period of time. I think it's about a couple of months, basically. And if you get a call from the BLS, this is all phone surveys, this is how they figure all this out, and you say, I'm unemployed, I really would like a job, but I haven't been looking for a job for, 2 weeks or 3 weeks. Okay, well, you're not even part of the labor force. In other words, I take you out of the whole equation of measuring unemployment. You're just not even part of the numerator or the denominator. You're out. So there's lots of hidden unemployment here. There's also underemployed people, marginally employed people, people who want more work, people who aren't making enough in the work that they have, even though they may be working full time. All of these things are kind of submerged in this official measure. I'm not going to go into the details, but suffice it to say, it's probably much higher than this. People say that the real unemployment rate is actually probably double what you see here, which is basically a catastrophe if you really think about it. If we're averaging somewhere around 7%, 14% of the labor force is unemployed. It's huge. I mean, the Great Depression, there was 20%. So anyway, you saw the long-term trend there. This is another long-term trend. This is the duration of unemployment. So 10 weeks is what we're starting out in January 1948. And you can see this continually goes up. Right now, the average duration of unemployment is all the way to 40 weeks. Before that, you can see it's still going up, 20 weeks of unemployment. And then the other is just kind of a smooth, the mean duration of unemployment. So say we started the recession in 1974, and we have X number of jobs and we start the recession, then we start to lose jobs, right? What this line says is, how long does it take in months for you to recover all the jobs you just had before the recession started? So we have 1974, 1981, 1990, 2000, 2007. You can see what's happening here. This is a deep structural problem. Unemployment is getting longer. We haven't even recovered, and not even anywhere near the employment that we had before the 2007 recession happened. And we're already at 48 weeks. And 48 months, excuse me, not weeks. So the point here is that, when you look at this, and I start to give you some of the explanations that you'll typically hear from mainstream commentators about why there's so much unemployment, and you're presented with this data, it's going to give you a very different view about what actually might be happening and the validity of the claims that you'll typically hear. Just to give you one real quickly, you don't have enough education. People need to go back to school. People need to upgrade their skills sets. They need to go back for training. The economy is sort of moving faster than people's skills and whatnot. So you hear explanations like that. Or, for example, another one is the baby boomer generation is causing more unemployment because more people are retiring. Or actually, that doesn't cause more unemployment, but it changes the labor force participation rate. There's all kinds of different explanations that you'll hear. But when you see a chart like this, it's pretty clear that there's something big, deep happening, all the way back to the 1970s. So a lot of these shorter-term explanations, yeah?
You're saying it's 4 years is the duration?
Yeah, so for 2001, the recession started in 2001. We didn't recover the amount of jobs that we had when the recession started in 2001 until 2005.
Okay.
Yeah. It's not like those people went anywhere. There wasn't mass retiring going on. There was just a lot more unemployed people, as the unemployment chart showed. So what about producing jobs? Whose responsibility is it to produce jobs? all we hear about in terms of a scapegoat for producing jobs is the government, right? They're the reason that the economy has gone into crisis to begin with. It's, either you're spending too much as a state, your local governments are overspending, or potentially you're not managing the economy correctly. You're not giving enough incentives, say, to business and whatnot. Well, again, in the longer term, if we look at, this is just the change in private employment, so it's the percentage change in employment in the private sector. And what's happening here, again, is it's going down dramatically. So the private sector, because it's not the government, right? The government sector actually is an area of increasing employment. But the private sector, which we never hear about in terms of the, kind of like blaming for issues of economic, macroeconomic problems, is obviously not been producing jobs. Now, we're going to get into some more complicated theory in this next chart, so I don't expect you to fully understand this. But maybe John will discuss a little bit more, but there's a theory that one of the reasons that there is actually so much unemployment, just a very simple, approximate, direct reason, is that since about, even before the Great Depression, since about the turn of the 20th century, as huge corporations developed, what happened as they grew is that they had lots of capacity, like factory space to produce things, but they tended not to use all of it, which was different than before when there was smaller businesses that tended to use all of their productive capacities, and when they weren't using it, they might they'd lay people off or not have that extra capacity. They'd actually get rid of it if there was moves. And if there was busts. So this is capacity utilization. So say I'm I'm GM producing cars, and I have a factory in Detroit, Michigan, and that factory can produce 10 million cars. Typically, I'm only producing 8 million. 80% is the capacity. What does that mean? That you have all kinds of idle equipment around, and you have unemployed people. Because when you have idle equipment, your easiest way to save on that equipment is to just lay people off, Because when you need to use it, when your capacity goes up, then you hire them. But if your capacity if it goes down, you don't sell the equipment, you lay off people. So the idea here is that it's workers that actually suffer because of the structural change in the economy. But just look at this. This is kind of amazing. We have the ability to produce quite a bit. For example, what if we wanted to produce a green grid or renewable technologies? We have the industrial capacity to produce an enormous amount more, and if people had good jobs, there's all likelihood that they would actually participate in the economy in much higher numbers. As it is, there's a very low participation rate and a very high unemployment rate. So what's been happening to workers in particular? So we've had a lot of technology advances, of course, and this is reflected in increasing productivity. At the same time that there's been increasing productivity, labor compensation around the 1960s, late 1960s, started to diverge from productivity. In the 1930s, there was a huge discussion between labor, the big unions, when they were at their most powerful, and the corporations, saying we need to peg gains in productivity to wages. Their argument was not, that we want some fixed amount of wages increased each year. We want our wages actually pegged to the amount the amount that we increase our productivity. Well, that started to change. That battle was obviously lost. As this indicates, this is compensation and this is productivity. This is a yawning gap here. What this means, of course, is that this is surplus that's going to capital. It's going to capitalists, their business, and laborers or workers are getting much, much less. So this is just another way to measure this. This is value added in manufacturing. So say you have, some car goes through a production process, and at each stage more value is added to it. The percent of wages in that total of value added has obviously been declining sharply, from 27% to almost 15% in 2005. So that's actually done with all of the charts and data, luckily. I just want to make sure you all realize that the data's out there. There's people that analyze these problems that look at them radically differently than the way that you will typically hear about them in the media. And unfortunately, it's so backwards that you almost need to extract yourself completely and try to understand some of the other theories, because there is a lot of pieces of the puzzle. I just showed you lots of different data, and I'm sure a lot of it didn't necessarily make that much sense. But there's integrated theories about why these tendencies are actually happening that, of course, tend not to blame workers. Not because they don't want to, but because there's no reason to. When you really look at the economy, the US economy has been slowing down its growth rate for decades now. It's stagnating. And the stagnation is not the result of workers somehow having some kind of psychological, educational, socio-cultural problems. It just doesn't make any sense. Number one, it's happening in advanced capitalist nations across the world, not just in the United States. Western Europe is having a lot of the same problems. So there's something very, deep that is wrong with the economy. But because we're starting with, kind of like if you think about media and advertising, we have all this advertising that's kind of just been stuffed into our brains. And it's difficult to kind of extract oneself to it, no matter how much, even if you critique it, it still gets inside your brain. And you really have to, as you're studying something like economics, try to take a step back and kind of almost forget everything that you thought you knew, or kind of comes as an impulse, because it just makes it harder to understand what's really going on. So one last thing I want to do is an international comparison. This is actually just a quote I just found today in the newspaper. I get a bunch of emails about news, and this was actually Mark Thoma, I think, or is this Gillian Tech? But yeah, I have another quote from Mark Thoma, but just pointing out that 23% of national income is going to the top 1%, so the bottom 99%. I mean, this is a trend that's been happening for quite a while now, where the 1% is getting more and more of total national income, and it's still going on. So if our movement lost any relevance, losing our sights, we didn't lose any relevance in terms of the empirical reality. If anything, we have all the more reason to fight and continue this battle. And just so you know where you are in the world, this is the share of employees in low-wage work. In all of the major Western industrial countries, 25% almost in the United States is the low-wage workers. So we're the wealthiest country in the world, right? But obviously that wealth isn't shared throughout the society. And it's really interesting to see how we stack up against these other countries. And notice that these are the, why do you think these are the most powerful countries? Well, it's because they're able to produce things at a much lower cost. They're actually, this may look bad in social terms. We look at it and say, oh, that's bad. Yeah, but in terms of, business and corporations, this is great. This means that I'm able to produce pretty sophisticated goods at a lower price, because my unit labor costs, my costs for labor, are much cheaper. So the purpose of this presentation was, I didn't think that I could kind of develop a whole different alternative theory, but I did want to give people a sense that there is these theories out there, and I think that they could be really powerful and useful in our movement, because they will really back up every argument that we make. If we're critical of Bank of America, for example, of Islar Jeffs, the way that it's treated home foreclosures, this kind of theory would really help us deepen that critique and really understand and feel confident, in making our arguments and developing our campaign proposals, for example. The same goes for foreclosures. You hear a lot of things, for example, about foreclosures about, again, it's the, what were the people doing deciding to borrow or to buy those houses, right? Well, of course, we know, number one, that there's a lot of predatory lending going on. That's one issue. The other issue is that, our income as a class, as the, sort of the workers in the economy, has been going down. Our share in income has been going down dramatically, so our consumer debt has gone up. That's one reflection, that's one aspect of consumer debt, the foreclosures. But you can see that it's related to this long-term, bigger problem. That's what I wanted to emphasize. Okay, now I'm going to turn it over to John. Or do you have a question?
I think I understood what the graph was about. It was saying that the value added to the product, percentage. So is that So is that a sampling of manufacturing facilities across the country and saying that in 2005, 15% of their cost went to wages, whereas in 1975, 27% of the total cost was to wages?
Yeah,
Okay, I just want to make sure.
that's exactly it. I mean, it's close. That's pretty much it. Yeah.
I was just going to lay out a general way of thinking about economic problems and I don't want to get into a lot of complexities. What I want to do is talk about how should we approach the problem of the economy. I mean, it's as coming from representing the 99%. And Karl Marx, when they created the International Working Men's Association, which is known as the First International, Karl Marx gave the inaugural address, the general inaugural address to the International Working Men's Association. And he made his theme the political economy of the capitalist class versus the political economy of the working class. So his theme was really to articulate a political economy of the working class. The idea was that the economics or the political economy that existed in that day, that people generally heard about, was from a particular standpoint, the standpoint of the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class. But there was another way of looking at the economy, and that was from the standpoint of the working class. What I want to do here is to just talk about the political economy of the 99%. As you know, we hear about the political economy or the economics of the 1% all the time. That's what we hear. What does the economy look like if viewed from the other standpoint, from the standpoint of the 99%? That is from the bottom. And I want to start at the most basic level. When I talk to students at the university or to a lot of different groups, I realize that when you mention the system, when you start talking about the question of the system that governs the United States, my students tend to think the system in the United States is democracy. They think that's the system. Of course, anyone who is, people who are fairly well educated know that the system, when we say the system, it doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean that in business circles. It doesn't mean that in social science and so on. But the students come in because it's part of their background, part of the propaganda, and they think the system is democracy. And what you have to explain to them is that the system isn't democracy, the system is capitalism. Or they sometimes call it the market economy, which is a euphemism and also a very misleading characterization. John Kenneth Galbraith called it, said it was the core of the economics of innocent fraud when they replaced the notion of capitalism with market economy. Because market economy is basically a meaningless term. Well, capitalism tells you a lot about the system. And it's for hundreds of years we've understood this system as a capitalist system, at least in its economic foundations. In the basic economics, when we talk about the system, we're referring to capitalism. And it isn't democracy at all. In other words, our society isn't run on a democratic basis. It isn't run on people going out and voting, and then the society does what the population asks them to do. It's not run by the government. It's not run by the state. And in fact, the state doesn't really represent the population, and so on. In this group, you already know that. But the fundamental thing to look at, if you want to understand our society and how it's run, is the system, by which we mean the capitalist system. And what is capitalism? Why do we use the term capitalism, which the they try to get away from, but of course they use it all the time in economic and financial circles. It's fundamental to understanding how our economy and society works. In school textbooks, they're taking the term capitalism out, but in business circles and financial circles and economics and so on, in social science it remains vital. What do we mean when we say capitalism? Well, we mean a system that is directed at the accumulation of capital. That's why we call it capitalism. The whole goal of the system, the whole meaning of this system is the accumulation of capital. And of course, the accumulation of capital, part of that is getting profits, right? But it's more than that, because it's about not only getting those profits, but accumulating them. That is, it involves a savings and investment process. We say you get the profits, and then you have to reinvest them in new capital formation and expand the economy, and you amass wealth in the process. And the people who are involved in this process, who basically own and in many respects govern the economy, they're the capitalist class, the owners, what we're now calling the 1%. They own the means of production in the society. They make the fundamental decisions. Now, we're always told today that we live in a market society, or a market economy, and that it's a natural process. It works somehow just through exchange on some sort of natural fair basis. It's just like the Saturday market. Our whole economy is like that, blown up large. It's got perfect competition. It's got market efficiency. It's a system that I was working on all the different ways in which they characterize this, but it's defined as fair and efficient and involving perfect information and pure competition and all of that. It's and it's naturalized. They say this is built in to our DNA as human beings, right? That we have a self-interest gene. We basically have a capitalist gene, and that actually in early stages of history they didn't know that. They haven't really built society properly on that gene, but now we have, and we've reached this natural society that's a self-regulating society, self-regulating market, efficient, profitable, productive, the most efficient system on earth, and it's fair, right? And people get their desserts. That the billionaires are there because they've given that much to the society, right? And you're down here, I assume most of you aren't billionaires, because you've given very little to the society. And it's described that way, okay? But what we're getting at here then, actually, is that economics is an ideology in service of power. This is a description of how things work that has been crafted over centuries to justify a particular order. And I'll tell you one thing about there are a lot of ways in which you can understand this ideology of economics. The most important thing to understand is, well, I'm saying that it's a system of power, right? That it's an ideology of power, and it's defending a system of power which is capitalism. The whole purpose of economics, of mainstream economics, of the dominant view, is to disguise relations of power and to say that they don't exist. So actually, mainstream economics, believe it or not, and this has been true since the late 19th century, the concept of class, right? the notion that society is divided into classes, let's say a capitalist class, a professional managerial class, lower middle class, working class, and so on. The notion that classes exist, economic and social classes, that's excluded entirely from mainstream economics. The concept of class does not exist at all. The whole thing is based on the notion that the economy is based on individuals and the classes don't exist. What about power in terms of corporations? The whole model is based on the notion that we basically have a very highly competitive economy that is organized as though we have innumerable small firms, none of which have any control over the market, over price, investment, output, or anything else. They describe the economy in those terms. Now, every one of you knows that there are giant corporations, right? But economic theory, mainstream economic theory, does not include that in its basic models, because if it did, it would suggest that the whole economy is organized around power. And they actually de-emphasize inequality for this reason. There's no notion of entrenched inequalities. They talk about imperfections, but they treat them as though they're very minor. And what about all the social costs? What about people's, all the way the economy, decisions within the economy cause some people to not have health insurance and for the environment to be destroyed? Pollution, the release of carbon into the atmosphere and global warming and poverty and all of these tragedies that we know about in our society that sociologists study, not economists. They're just called externalities. And why do they call them externalities? It's because they aren't a part of the logic of the economy. They're not internal to the economy. They're things that are, cast off by the economy, but they don't even have to consider these issues within their fundamental model. All right? So what I'm trying to tell you is it's an analysis, and we could go into all the specifics. We could talk about the most fine points in economics, but it's an analysis that excludes power, and more it excludes power. There is, in the 1980s, they developed in economics, they've developed more and more extreme models, more mathematical, more extreme. The assumptions are more restrictive all the time, so that there are two big schools on macroeconomics. One is the new classical economists, the other is the new Keynesian economists. But they both agree on the basic starting point, and that is rational expectations. That's the starting point of their theories. What is rational expectations? And I kid you not, the rational expectations hypothesis assumes that everyone in the United States, or in the world economy, but all economic actors use calculus in making all their decisions and read the economic journals and know what they say and make their decisions on that basis. I kid you not, this is true. The economists say, well, they know this isn't true, but they say that this makes our models work better. And Ben Bernanke, he's the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board. He gave a speech last year about why they didn't see the great financial crisis coming, why the models failed. And Bernanke gave his explanation, and again, I kid you not, his explanation is that the models were designed only for economic prosperity. the models did not include the possibility of economic crisis in them. Not of any kind of a major economic crisis. That was excluded in the models. And he defended, he said, yeah, we didn't see this coming, but the models worked really well as long as the economy was going up, so there was nothing wrong with these models. Now that's like a meteorologist who predicts only sunny days, right? And when there's a big storm, he says, well, it's not the fault of my model. It wasn't part of the model, and the model worked as long as the sun was out. Right? Literally, but why could they be so stupid? Well, it isn't stupid because it's an ideology, it's a justification. It's Bernanke, who became Federal Reserve Chairman partly because he declared that economic crisis was over. He came up with the term in 2005 or 6, or in the he was actually in Bush's economic advisor. He came up with the term the Great Moderation to say that we had forever licked the problem of depression and serious economic crisis, that it was gone, that we had all the solutions and so on. He came out with that, yeah, and just a few years later, then I think he came out with that in 2003, and then a few years later we have this incredible crisis. But why would they argue that economic crisis had been eliminated? Well, they actually brought back what's called Say's Law, a proposition that John Maynard Keynes had torn to bits and that Marx had torn to bits before that. And it says supply creates its own demand, and there can never be the system couldn't generate a major economic crisis. The only way you could have an economic crisis is if say workers refuse to let their wages be lowered, or some interference from outside. But the system itself was crisis-free. They brought back these propositions. They brought back the most propositions that had long been thrown out. I'll give you another example of how power is excluded, right? And that is consumer sovereignty. You've all heard about the notion of consumer sovereignty, right? And the one thing we know in the United States is that the consumers decide everything, right? The whole economy is a product of our decisions in terms of consumption. Well, of course, that's absurd. Why do you think they're spending $1 trillion a year, more than $1 trillion a year? But in 2006, it was $1 trillion by conservative figures on marketing in the United States. They're doing it to determine what people buy. It's a system of power. It's the most sophisticated propaganda system ever developed in human history. All the techniques of propaganda now, and the way they run presidential elections and everything else is determined by this. I don't need to go into how the economy has affected power and so on, but the whole ideology of economics is telling you that we have a system that's unrelated to power relations. And what we need, well, the political economy of the 99% says no. And this the great slogan, the slogan of the 99% and the critique of the 1%. Finally, people are starting to focus on that there really is a very powerful element at the top of the society that runs things, that controls things, and so on. And this isn't conspiratorial. We're talking about we're talking about millions of people at the top, at least worldwide. But it's a system. It's an institutional framework that we have where wealth is very concentrated. How concentrated is the wealth in the United States? Well, if you took the 400 richest people in the United States, right, the Forbes 400, You've all heard about them. They're all billionaires, but not all billionaires make it into that group. You have to be a big billionaire to make it into the Forbes 400. Those 400 people, have you ever been in a room with 400 people? But those 400 people have as much wealth as half the population in the United States. I don't know if you can think of being in a room with 400 people and think of them being as billionaires, and those people own as much as 150 million people in this country. Well, you know, but they only have one vote, like we have one vote, and they don't have, this is a democracy, and they don't have any more say about the society than the rest of us, right? So in economics textbooks, they don't, they're just like anybody else. And even the institutional role of these individuals, usually commanding, you know, as they're often CEOs or in the command, headquarters of the giant corporations. The fact that they have this institutional power is ignored in economics. The fact that they rule over corporations like Apple or Microsoft or GM or General Electric or NBC. So you have that, if you look at the top 1%, actually, John Muell's figures are a little out of date, but in 2007, the wealthiest 1% of, I think you were giving wealth figures, but maybe you're giving income. The wealthiest 1% of the U.S. population had 34% of all the income, all the wealth in the country, sorry. The 1% has 34% of the income as of 2007, just before the crisis. That means, and the bottom half of the population has 3%. I said income. We're talking about wealth. Let me repeat this. The wealthiest 1% has 34% of the wealth.
Financial wealth?
Total wealth.
Okay.
In financial wealth, they have a larger percent. So the bottom half of the population has 3%. So the 1% has 10 times as much wealth as the bottom half of the population, 150 million people. If you look in between 1950 and 1970, for each additional dollar made by those in the bottom 90%, those in the top 100th of 1%, 100th of 1% made $162. But in between 1990 and 2002, for each dollar made by those in the bottom 90%, those in the top 100th of 1% made $18,000. If you look at it globally, 2% of the world's population has more than half of the world's wealth. Well, the top 1% of wealth holders in the world have over 40% of the world's wealth. And this is getting more and more concentrated. And this is a power relation. But how does this come about? It's because when you sell your labor, your capacity to work, your labor power, when you go and get a job, you enter the wage contract. What you're selling is not a given amount of work, you're selling your capacity to work over a given amount of time. And you're paid in compensation a wage, but there is a surplus that's the residual to your wage. That is all the income generated that goes beyond your wage, all the value added going beyond your wage goes into property income. Value added breaks down into either wages or property income. And whatever doesn't go to the wages goes to the property income. And the surplus, that surplus proportion, that surplus portion that goes to property is huge. and the discrepancy is widening. So if you're at the top of this whole system, you're a billionaire, you're owner of large shares of corporations, and every one of the, maybe 10,000, 30,000 workers, or maybe many more than that, in a single corporation are adding to your wealth every day they work, every hour they work. A portion of the value added that they create goes to you, and just by virtue of your owning the company. This is a system that generates enormous inequality, and because of the inequality, there's all sorts of instability, particularly because of the inequality. And it's a system that's oriented towards crisis and stagnation. When the system gets into a crisis, the role of the state is to bail out capital, and the role of the government will always tell you that what they're doing is trying to promote jobs. What they're mostly trying to do is promote profits. And jobs are at best an indirect benefit, a kind of trickle-down effect. What they're doing is serving the system, and they have to. That's the way it works. If there's an economic crisis, why does an economic crisis happen? Well, there's a lot of explanation. There's a lot of causes of economic crisis, but every economist will agree on one thing. And if we have an economic crisis or a long-term economic slowdown, it's always because investment has declined. And that's what the capitalist class is supposed to be doing. They're supposed to be investing. That is capital formation, accumulation of capital. But they won't invest, particularly in a monopoly capitalist system, a very highly concentrated system. They won't invest unless their expectations profit 5 or 10 years down the line, if they build new productive capacity and so on. Unless they can expect to get the kind of return, a certain kind of return, they won't take the risk. They won't invest. And so crises are almost always due to an investment strike. They'll blame everybody else, but it always means capital formation isn't occurring. Now, the capitalist class and conservatives will say, well, it's because wages are too high and workers' productivity is too low and so on, and so our profits are being squeezed, so we're not going to invest. But in our society, there's rapidly rising productivity. And real wages, believe it or not, real wages are the same level that they were when Lyndon Johnson was president. Some of you actually probably, I remember Johnson, a lot of you remember Johnson, but that was a long time ago. We haven't seen real wages, the real wage level rise since Lyndon Johnson. But profits have been going up and up, and productivity has been going up and up. Well, where are all the benefits going? This is a system of power, and you got this enormous surplus concentrating at the top, and they can't find the demand. So they've developed various ways of stimulating the economy through military spending, through financialization, financial bubbles, through promoting the sales effort, that is the whole marketing system, and various other ways they have of trying to promote the economy. In the United States, the economy isn't promoted by civilian government spending, because civilian government spending as a share of GDP hasn't increased since 1938. It's at the same level it was in 1938, 39, and it's been absolutely flat for the last 40 years. There's been no increase in civilian government spending as a share of GDP. That excludes transfer payments, which just redistribute. I mean, the government takes on more transfer payments, but that just redistributes income from one person to another, or one group to another. and it excludes military spending. But civilian government spending, that is actual civilian government spending, consumption and investment by government as a share of GDP hasn't increased at all the last 40 years, and is actually at the same level it was at the end of the 1930s. So what keeps the civilian government spending down? Well, that's power. Now, economists just won't tell you these things. Yesterday, the newspaper said Social Security is in trouble. It's going to be running out of money 3 years earlier than before. Social Security is actually the most stable part of our entire economy. Everything else is, things are, it's been incredibly stable. But why is Social Security? Why are the estimates that the Social Security is going to run out 3 years earlier? And well, guess what? One thing is that there's been an economic slowdown, so that affects the revenue coming in through Social Security. But the Social Security had predicted, the administration had predicted a long-term rate of growth of 1.7%. So it's in their projections. So that's not really the big factor. Why are they going to run out of money early? Well, it's because Obama cut the payroll tax, right? And, oh, everybody liked that. He got money back. But no Republican president has ever been able to do that. And of course, no Democratic president has been willing to cut the payroll tax before. Because you cut the payroll tax and you cut the revenue going into Social Security. Social Security was stable, but now they're destroying it. And then that becomes a basis for restructuring it and privatizing it. And no Republican president could have done this. Only a Democrat president could do that. The same thing with education. Education has been privatized much more rapidly, much more systematically under Obama than Bush. The reason why no Republican president could go after Social Security is because the Democrats would have stopped them. But the Republicans aren't going to stop the Democrats. What's known as the only Nixon can go to China principle. But in terms of the economy, in terms of whatever left we have of the welfare state, we have a Democrat in power. They can destroy the remnants of the welfare state much more rapidly than a Republican can. Think about Clinton. Think about how he went after the welfare state, welfare system. Think about, who was in terms of the economy, who was the most radical president of the post-Second World War period? It was Richard Nixon, right? That's when the civilian government spending as a percentage of GDP went up its highest. So I want to kind of shake things up. We've got a system of power, and actually both political parties are tied into it, and we shouldn't have too many illusions. Obama has, in the financial crisis, he fueled his administration with personnel from the top banks, we did a study of that, of the financial power lead in his administration. There's no way that he was about to go after the banks. You could see that just by the way they staffed the administration. Even if he had the power to do so, because the power is actually, the power in the financial realm is in the Federal Reserve Board, which was basically owned by the banks. The banks are members, the financial community controls the Federal Reserve Board, and the government doesn't, the population doesn't. It's not responsive to democracy in the slightest. So we have a system of power, we have a capitalist system, and almost all the fundamental elements of the problem are left out. If you read the newspapers, if you watch TV, if you try to learn about these things, you will be systematically misled. I remember Doug Dowd, is a famous economist, once said capitalism is like a bad compass. It takes you systematically in the wrong direction. That was the first time I came to Eugene. That's what I heard, and I thought. But the economics ideology is even worse, and so it will in every way possible prevent you from looking at questions of power. Why? Because the real power of society lies at the bottom. Because the 150 million people who, or 300 million people, but the 150 million people who only have as much wealth as the 400 might get mad and say, couldn't you guys, couldn't you afford to share some of that with us? And they might even go in the streets. They might even do what used to be called a revolution. Revolutions can take all sorts of different forms. We're kind of worried about it in our society. Our society was built on a revolution and built on other revolutions that preceded that. A revolution is really about, in human history, is about the population deciding to take history into their own hands and change it and try to create a more human-oriented system. And actually, all the great moments of progress, of social progress in human history have involved revolutions. And it seems to me about time, or are we going to wait until the 400, the Forbes 400 has wealth equal to 75% of the U.S. population, or 90% of the U.S. population? At what point are we going to decide that this is actually a system of power, and it's a system that doesn't provide for people's basic needs, it doesn't provide for people's health, their education, it doesn't provide jobs, much less useful and empowering and developmental work. It's an alienating and destructive society. It's destroying the entire earth, and we watch our children suffer. And Einstein, in the first issue of Monthly Review, said that he wrote a piece called Why Socialism, and he said the greatest sin of capitalism, he didn't use the word sin, but his greatest criticism of capitalism was that it crippled individuals. And you look out in this society and what you find is a mass of crippled individuals, because the resources of society are being redistributed. In order to do that, they have to cripple the entire population mentally, emotionally, physically, and take away the future in order to keep this system of power going. Anyway, this is a way to look at it from the standpoint, I think, of the 99%.
We've been ending at about 8:30, and I thought what would be fun to do, I feel like these are difficult discussions to have, like I said, because it gets pretty complex unless someone like John is explaining it, and it's a lot better. But what I thought we could do is definitely have a little bit of discussion. And one thing we don't get to do as often, one thing I really like to do as an academic, is really try to think about, again, how these ideas can help us, for example, in our campaign proposals, or just in our basic understanding of what's going on. So I think any kind of question or discussion will be great to have. And I'd particularly like to hear, maybe even discuss a little bit how we can kind of use some of these ideas to our advantage and the kind of organizing we're doing right now.
I mean, I'd like to ask John, what you see following our capitalism after the revolution. What's the system that you would see in place?
Well, I mean, I don't think you can have democracy unless anything that's a meaningful democracy unless people have control over their production decisions. and when there's more community control. And there has to be planning at different levels of society, at the local level, at the national level. There has to be. And that can be part of a democratic process. And we don't really have any alternative. We can't deal with this environmental problem or other problems without some kind of social planning and decision making and so on. I went to Venezuela a year ago, and I was a guest of the government and talked to the top minister. Chavez actually got ill right then, and I didn't meet him, but we talked about how they were doing things and how they were trying to use their position within the state to redistribute resources to local, to communal councils so that they could organize their own lives and conditions and improve. I think we have the capability of doing a lot of these things, but it's a revolution. Once it starts, then there'll be thousands of ideas, and it'll be, and we're in a new period of history. It's what we decide to do. I don't think there's an existing model, but that's what makes it exciting. They'll tell you you can't do that because then you would have a real wreck of a society. If you tried to have a revolution, you'd have all sorts of people unemployed, and people in poverty, people going hungry, and so on. And what I'm saying is, what do we have to lose? Right now, we're spending, the United States is spending $1 trillion actually on the military, $500 billion in the acknowledged figures, but even in the U.S. accounts, it's $1 trillion a year. And even if you look at the acknowledged figures on military spending, we're spending as much as all the other countries in the world put together on the military. I grew up in the Cold War era, and we used to say, well, we're in an arms race, we have to match the opponent. Well, it seems like the opponent is the whole rest of the world. But why do we need to spend $500 billion or $1 trillion a year on the military? When people don't have homes, and people don't have food, and people don't have jobs, why do we need to, of course they'll say the military provides jobs, but it's a very inefficient way to do that. Why do we have to spend $1 trillion on convincing people to buy things through marketing, right? When people didn't need to be convinced to buy garbage. When other people, when there's so many people where their basic needs aren't satisfied. So I think that if we have a social, ecological, cultural revolution, these kinds of questions about what the priorities of the society are could come out, and we couldn't lose from the effort, right?
How does, you just alluded to neocolonialism, or, what's the word they're using?
Imperialism.
Neoliberalism, and how we use our military to conquer resources abroad, and that costs the American taxpayer. How do you see those things coming into play in economic models, capitalism in this country, and also the prison industrial complex? How do you see these things working into that system, and or how do you think that they best justify these things? What are the arguments that you hear? I mean, I hear them all the time, but how do you take apart those arguments? I mean,
well,
I know it's a broad question, but
well, first of all, neoliberalism is an extreme market philosophy, market fetishism. The notion is it's really the myth of the self-regulating market taken to absolute extremes, which we've seen. Hayek's version of the economy, which we've seen come into the forefront in the last 20 years. And it's gone hand in hand with the financialization of the economy. And what happens is that, okay, the economy is slowing down. If you took that issue of Monthly Review, the one called with the endless crisis on it, and you look, like on page 3, there's a graph, and it'll show you how the economy has slowed down. So if you have a pie, let's say the economy is a pie, and the pie isn't increasing in size, but the people at the top always have to have bigger amounts. How do they get bigger pieces of pie when the pie isn't getting bigger?
They're taking our pie.
They have to decrease the share, the pieces of everybody else. So neoliberalism is this ideology and this whole redistribution mechanism that's been going into effect, that's really redistributing wealth and income to the top, not simply through the normal capitalist function of growth function, but through using the agency of the state and the state's manipulation of the market to create redistributive effects that increase the shares of those at the top. So that's one thing. In terms of the prison industrial complex, I mean, I put it together with the military, and we had an issue on education of the Monthly Review, and I had set up a chart on how much to show how much bigger the expansion of the, let's say, the whole security complex was relative to education. Military spending is 3 times K-12, and then the prison industrial complex has been expanding astronomically. And you put this together, and meanwhile they're squeezing education to death. We have the highest incarceration rates in the world, so high that you probably have to take, ours are so much beyond than any other countries. The Soviet Union and South Africa and so on never came anywhere close to the level of incarceration in the United States. And so the U.S., if you look at it in terms of a graph, the United States looks like a skyscraper compared to all of these other countries that have nowhere near the incarceration rate. Why are we doing that? You know, this is one way of, this is a power, this is a form of power, it's a form of maintaining control. It's also a way of, controlling the population, particularly restive parts of the population. It's a way of also directing economic, and directing capital to corporations who basically benefit from this.
Every bed that's filled. Yeah, Michael.
Yeah, I heard briefly Gar Parovitz on alternative radio yesterday talking about the alternative economy, co-ops, worker-owned companies. I don't know whether you talked about it, I got here late. It was very positive. I only caught like 5 minutes of it. But it was, he was very, I didn't realize how big a part of the economy it was. And he was optimistic that it could really make some change in this country, that we need to be focusing on the positive side of things. Do you have any comments, any examples of that?
Well, if you looked at this piece, The Endless Crisis, I think you would find that the last sentence is a quote from Karl Perovitz. And from that particular book. I do, and I'm, of course, familiar with his work. He tends to emphasize the local community level, which is appropriate. But, he doesn't really disagree with me fundamentally, but I think you have to remember, and the Venezuelan Revolution is a good example, you have to remember we actually need some kind of, we need sort of planning at the top as well as at the community and local level. And I'm not talking about a command economy, I'm talking about that something actually serves the local level and comes out of planning that's at the bottom. But we're going to need some kind of planning at the top too. It has to be democratic. It can't be controlling the society. It has to serve the bottom. But we can't do everything by just organizing communities. We wouldn't be able to solve our problems like that. So we need an integrated top and bottom system. Right now we just have everything is controlled from the top.
One of the things that I think of, just in quickly answering that too, is that, the system is really dynamic. The capitalist system is really dynamic, and in a really kind of perverse way, it will sort of bleed into areas that I think, in principle, initially may have had really good ideals and organization and whatnot, but then it's able to kind of turn that, even protest, it can turn into a sort of a profit, a market, almost a fad. And that also is a weakness of not having a little bit more control over the way that we produce, over the, the kind of rules of the game, so to speak. Because, a co-op, by the time it gets really big, just like any business, like major corporations will absorb innovating companies all the time. This is, if you look at Google's merger history recently, for example, there's tons of examples of small innovating companies. Maybe they have really good labor practices, for example. Then they get absorbed, and then that changes dramatically. So there's other contradictions as well when you're operating in a context really of very, very intense monopoly power, and it's only growing. We write about this as well. Just looking at the growth of concentration in different industries in the United States, which has been continuing, since the 1900s.
Thanks.
Problem. Yeah, she was next.
What do you think of the steady state economy, and are there any examples of that in existence?
Well, it's a kind of I think we need a steady state economy. We need to have an economy with no economic growth, at least in the rich economies. What we need in the United States is not more wealth. We don't need more wealth. We need to redistribute. We have to address what it is that we're producing and how we're living our lives and how we're relating to nature. We can't expand. We're already our ecological footprint in this country is so large that if the whole world was like the United States, it would take 6 planets. We can't do it, right? And so we need a steady state economy, but the problem is you can't have that under capitalism, because capitalism is the accumulation of capital. That's the whole thing. That's what it's all about. And if you have, right now we have a very slow growing economy in the United States, and even slower in Europe, right? The rate of growth in the United States right now is about 2%, which is incredibly slow given that we're the fourth year into a recovery. You're supposed to have like 6% rate of growth at this point in a recovery phase, and we got 2%, right? And in Europe, it's 1 or less right now. In Japan, the economies are stagnating. They're not growing very much at all in the triad, the rich countries. And but this isn't a steady state economy, because it's what Herman Daly calls, who's a friend, who calls a failed growth economy. Because you can't have a steady state economy that it's trying to expand. It's basically now, what are we doing? It's like our motor isn't, our engine isn't going, and we're stepping on the gas, we're flooding the motor, we're fracking we're trying to do anything we can to get this growth economy going again. And it's actually becomes more vicious. The capitalist economy becomes more vicious when growth is slow than it was before. So what we have to do is get out of it. We've got to have an economy that has a different purpose. But you can't get there. You can't get to that without a revolution, and a revolution with a pretty big R to it. The Forbes 400 are not going to like it, and the 1% is not going to like it if you say no growth. In fact, if we haven't even seen the security system that they would try to erect if they thought the population was serious about that. So it's a real problem. I mean, it means that you have to get rid of the capitalist class. There's no other way. You can't have a profit-based system. So,
Michael,
I'm trying to think of some of the ideas here as applied to organizing. The concept of an ideology of power it's good for me to think of economics in that way, because it seems to me as a movement or as a activist wanting to change our society, there's a real struggle for a common rhetoric that seems to make sense. And as I think about this, as I was trying to frame my question, it struck me that, wow, Occupy was started by Adbusters, and the concept of ad busting, breaking through the marketing of products and ideas, is where the impetus came from to really sort of set Occupy movements into overdrive across the country. And now we're struggling with how to continue to frame the efforts to change the system, when it seems like what you've been describing are some extraordinary dichotomies, maybe I could say, or
contradictions.
A surrealism that's huge, because it isn't sinking through just the military budget, for example. So I'm wondering if you could, in comparison to the international military budgets, ours being greater than all of the rest of them, and yet it seems that Americans are not really ready to reduce their defense spending. So I'm wondering if you see some tools for us to use to try to place the discussion on a local level in ways that I think we're really struggling with that right now. We see things that are obviously wrong, and we still can't get enough traction in the community over them.
Well, just one quick point to make on that. You know, when you look at U.S. movement history, like say before the 1930s, it's really staggering how much solidarity and solidarity on a really big goal for the country and for the movements that there was. And we have to remember that we were really robbed of a lot of that history. I mean, McCarthyism, you know, had a lot of pernicious effects, but it wasn't really just targeting communists or socialists, right? It was targeting the idea of a different way of organizing our lives, our society. And that's a major recovery that has to happen. And I agree with you that it's not easy to just translate, some of the ideas, because the contradictions are so big, to an everyday conversation that you might have in a community. But, people like, some of the organizing I do is when we talk about some of the theory of organizing, one of the things that we try to remember is that there's openings that happen at different times. We're probably in an opening that may get a little bit bigger, where people really start to question. And when people, like a large majority of people really start to question things, that's when you can start to have conversations that in normal times, may not be as possible. But there's a question there, there's a problem. It's whether we as activists, as we're organizing right now, in our discussions, not only, do things, like we're talking about doing these campaign plans, but then also try to agree and have some really, core discussions about where are we going to go with this, and how big are these contradictions, and sort of like, what does this mean for the way that we're going to organize in this as we build up our own solidarity and understanding. The hope is, from a movement perspective, is that when you have those openings, then you have the possibility of really spreading the ideas and getting a lot of people involved. Because I can tell you, what John was just saying about the security state, I think he's totally right. It's not totally directed at us as activists right now, but as our power grows, it's going to be. And the only way you can really defend against it in sort of the modern age, I think, is numbers. So you really have to have that built into your strategy of movements, of protest. It can't just be about, you got to always fight for local goals, but you always have to kind of keep your eye remember the contradictions, really kind of deal with the depth of the problem. So otherwise, we're just not being realistic, right? And so that's, it's a difficulty, but it's not insurmountable, mainly because there's so many contradictions in the system. It actually creates openings where people, who's the person going to listen to? The mainstream economist has been telling them we're in a recovery when they're unemployed and houseless. Are they going to continue to listen to that and believe it? Probably not, and we're actually getting to that point where it's not getting better. Actually, it was her first word.
John, you mentioned something about fracking, and it reminded me what I heard from Fareed Zakaria on the Global Public Square the other day, that he said, thank goodness for fracking, because the energy costs in the United States are going down, and that's going to draw manufacturing back into our country, and isn't that a wonderful thing? And I just could not believe I heard him say, thank goodness for fracking.
Who said that?
Fareed Zakaria. Now, I don't listen to him a lot, but I thought he was an economist, and, I don't know. I think I'll erase him from my podcast. But I just wonder, when you think, is this not in the economic model? Perhaps they're not thinking about reality? I mean, is it not fact?
Yeah, there's so many things wrong with that, right?
Yeah.
Of course, they don't think about in the economic community now they're celebrating what they're calling an energy boom because of fracking and shale oil and so on. But in terms of climate change and everything, it's a complete disaster in terms of all sorts of other problems. But the idea that it would move jobs back to the U.S. economy is silly. It's there are a lot of the problem with the economics is an ideology. One of the problems is that it's been set up as an ideology of power, but a lot of the economists get caught up in it, and they actually believe they fall for their own ideology in ways that the reason there's production, the production is taking place in China, is because U.S. multinational corporations and other multinational corporations are involved in what's called the global labor arbitrage, making profits off of these abysmally low wages. And energy has nothing to do with it, right? If you can pay, and right now you pay only 4% of a Chinese worker to do the same work that an American worker does, gets only 4% of the American wage, right? And this is being controlled by U.S. corporations, by the global corporations. So it has nothing to do. It's a fantasy to say that this is just about cost or energy and so on. It's much more complex than that. They're saving amazingly on labor costs. And but I wanted to say something about the other question. It made me think, we used to have this slogan, act locally and think globally. I think we have a slogan like act locally and change globally, right? Or something like that. And you were talking about how the military, how Americans don't want to cut the military spending. And the way I look at it is that the United States is Fortress America. This is the center, this is the hegemonic power, the center of a global imperial system, right? And the American population is part of this. This is the most conservative country on earth. This is the country that maintains the whole system globally. And, but we have radical movements in the United States. And, do you remember Seattle in 1999, November 1999? They had they had these mass protests in Seattle, of course, and riot. Unfortunately, I wasn't there, but it was like news. It was the top news in every country in the world, and it helped spawn a global movement. Why? Because, like, if it had happened in Rome, they would say, well, or in Paris, or in any number of countries, it wouldn't have been news at all. Because they always do that. They always go out en masse and protest. Why was this news for the whole world? It's because this is Imperial America, and the whole world suddenly saw that there were radical groups in the United States. There was protest in the United States inside the monster, as Jose Marti used to say. And that liberated everybody else. Everybody else, I mean, all over the world, they're involved in struggles. But they know that the United States is the enemy, is the repressive force. And so anything we do here in terms of resistance, in terms of struggle, is magnified because it helps everyone else. That's why the Vietnam War struggle, anti-war struggle was so important. Look at Occupy Wall Street. I mean, it wasn't that big compared to like what they were doing in Madrid. It was nothing, right? And or what they were doing in any number of countries before us, right? But it was on Wall Street. It was Americans occupying a small part on Wall Street, and it galvanized resistance in the entire world. So you have then thousands of cities taking that on. I mean, it started with the Arab revolts, but it became global because we did it here. So we act locally in our own struggles to change our society and our communities, and it has global effects because, you know, maybe for the wrong reason, because we're the global enemy, right? But those of us who are resisting within become very, very important. And this has been understood by the left for a long time, but it's something we have to remind ourselves of just how important our resistance movements here. Like a relatively small resistance in the United States, you know, it's like our numbers are 1,000 times as big because of this.
That's good news, right?
I just have a couple more questions. 1, 2.
Yeah. Now, I heard you talk at City Club, and that's why I came tonight. Because you predicted that it's the financial section that's getting these bubbles that cause crises, and they're happening closer and closer. Do you remember saying that? Because I'll tell you with my question.
Yeah, okay.
And you predicted that there was going to be another one, you know.
Well, inevitably there'll be another one, yeah.
Yeah. So I had thought that when we were coming together tonight was that we would focus on what we should do when that new bubble happens to be explanatory to people as to why it happened as a way of getting us more massively organized.
Well, what I think is a little bit different than that the bubble is a symptom, right? The bubble and even the bursting of the bubble is a symptom. The real problem is stagnation, the slowing down of the economic growth rates, the slowing down of the economy that started in the 1970s. And it's actually a slowdown that's getting us back on track. It's a problem that's been around for a long, long time. But every decade, the growth rate in the advanced capitalist countries, in the advanced industrial countries, the triad, every decade the rate of growth is slower than the decade before. And we're only marginally above the Depression decade, and this last decade is only marginally. The economy is slowing down. How did they stimulate the economy? The only way they have of stimulating the economy right now is financialization, financial bubbles, but this sort of secular process of financialization. So they're trying to get it going again to lift the economy. And they may succeed, and then we'll have another bubble and another. But if the underlying problem is there, and it's the slowing down of the economy. A lot of us were politically aware in the 1960s, right? And there was a sense that there was economic growth and a lot of things were expanding, education, health. There was a sense of kind of prosperity and growth and expansion. But for generations now, I mean, at least since the 1970s, we have been cutting and cutting at all the social welfare, education, health, for 3 decades now, we've been told over and over, the population is told, we can't afford this, we can't afford that, we can't afford to protect the environment, we can't afford to provide health to the population, we can't afford to educate our children, we can't afford this and that, and this is what we should be focusing on, the underlying problem that we're in this long-term vice. Financial bubbles are just a symptom of this larger problem.
Can I name it as I really stay grounded? I've had a class somewhere in the 50s where the professor took us to a steel mill, and he explained how many people used to work there, but on account of some modernization stuff, it took 8 people to press the levers and the buttons and things to make that whole steel mill go. So what we know is that as we get the technology better, we need fewer and fewer people to do what's called work. We just need fewer people to work. That's why you have a jobless recovery. You don't need the same number of people to have
but you're just talking
productivity.
You're talking about in the terms of capitalism, right?
I'm talking in terms of someone at a more visual level.
Yeah.
Where you can see that we have all this machinery that are basically doing jobs that people used to do.
Yeah, but why did we introduce the machinery? And so because it increases wealth, right? And so then what do we do with that wealth? It saves time. Do we reduce, we could reduce people's working hours, we could redistribute the wealth, we could use that wealth to create jobs in areas that really benefit society. We could do all sorts of things. But because it's a capitalist system, it just turns, it's just a way of turning the screw, and it's not a way of, it doesn't really produce the benefits for the population.
There's another really big contradiction. Let's take what's happening in China right now, like in Foxconn. There's hundreds of thousands of people that work in those factories. Would you agree that those factories could potentially be automated so that they used a lot fewer people? But they could.
It's a rhetorical question, right?
No, it's not. Well, don't you think? If you think about what they're doing, they're polishing cases, right? They're assembling things. Realistically, that could be done in the same way the steel mill was automated, but it's not right now, at least, right? Because the labor is cheap. It oscillates in different directions, right? They're using an enormous amount of labor because it's so cheap. Now, the wages in Chinese people are going up a little bit, and they're going to introduce more technology and robotics and whatnot, and then that will put people out into the streets again. But then, of course, production changes. We've been integrating technologies for generations now. It hasn't, if we were in a society that were producing just what we needed, that might be a realistic way that we're throwing lots of people out of work. But of course, there's all kinds of new things being produced, some totally useless things, some ecologically incredibly destructive things, just for the purpose of making profit, any kind of widget you can think of. So it's not necessarily on the aggregate level that there's just people with nothing to do at all. The system, there's all kinds of different forms of production that will open up. I could consider someone who actually makes beds in a hotel a manufacturer in a sense. They are supposed to finish a certain amount of rooms every single day. It's almost like assembling a good, So I think it's a lot more complicated than just saying technology has completely changed things. It could potentially, but you have to remember that you're in a society where we're not producing for need, we're not producing for necessity. If we were doing that, we would probably have stopped automating and, like John said, created more leisure time and started consuming a lot less. But the whole system is based on accumulation and increased consumption. So there's always going to be the new gadget, the new whatever, and actually it could be a very high amount of labor that's involved in producing those goods, and it could oscillate between more technology and more labor.
Okay, so I'll take another issue, which is the fact that it's called resources, that there are non-renewable resources, not only oil and the one we talk about, but a whole lot of other non-renewable resources. And China's trying to make all kinds of contracts to aggregate so they have their sphere where they can get all the pieces they need to do what they need to do for their manufacture. We're trying to do it too. There's a book called The Race to the Last of the Natural Resources.
Resource Wars, maybe?
What?
Resource Wars is one, but anyway.
No, but there is a growing crisis in non-renewable resources where all nations who are industrializing and technologizing are trying to make sure that they have the resources they need to keep doing their thing that's no good, that we agree, is growth. That's what they're doing. That's going to be a crisis. So what I'm trying to talk about is how do we talk about what we know are looming crises in such a way that we're organized so that we say what that crisis is and what the turning point is for the ecologically more doable stuff, so that we have our own image of how we want the society to go in terms of a good direction. And I know you want that to happen in this dialogue, but I don't know how to make it move that way. I'm trying to make it move that way. For, you know, if we take all the things that are liable to happen and figure out what our planned response is, even if we're going to keep changing our plan, but that we're making the plans for doing the thing that's better for us. You know, like instead of privatizing things, we figure out how to non-privatize them and put them in the public sphere again, that all of us can have access. You know, that kind of the public privatization battle that I look at and I say, oh my God, how we mix things up. You know, where our public parks, instead of being for us, the corporations log out you know, there are these issues where supposedly it belongs to us, but we see the corporations again use it for their private gain. I'm asking for how we build something where we do this kind of planning. It's very complex. You know, I have notes on it, but
Well, just to give you, I think it's a brilliant point, and it's obviously a very difficult point. Just to give you one example, in Venezuela, like John was talking about, they're thinking about these things a lot. They're thinking about radically reorganizing, you know, not only what they produce, why they produce it, how much they use in terms of efficiency, but also like the character of the production, you know, like cooperatives or with different types of control, things like that, different types of ownership. That's in a society or a country that is actively trying to pursue alternative methods, and they have a lot of contradictions, a lot of difficulties. So when you take that same problem and you say, well, what are we going to do here in the United States? How do we actually plan around it? I think we have to realize that we're at a very early stage, and to me, one of the keys to sort of achieving that, or like the way that I would say it is, we need to have, you know, more decentralized control, or more actual worker control within communities over our production. Because like a great example is there's this documentary that came out about auto workers in LA. There was a campaign to try to create more ecological cars in the factories, and organizers went right to the workers and they say, you know, if you had control of the factory, what kind of cars would you want to produce if you had the choice, if that was your choice? And they were like, well, I don't know. They couldn't even conceive it because it just seems so unreal. But if you think about it, if you look at these, there's public surveys that come out like, you know, what would you do as a community? Like, what's your priority? They're vastly different than the people that are controlling the economy, right? So I guess the short answer is we need to obviously increase the power of people to have control over their labor, over their decisions, over their communities. But that's a radical change. That means you have to redistribute power. So that's.
I got it, but it starts with your imagination, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah, but yeah.
It's 8:32 right now.
It's only 2 minutes over.
Yeah, I just wanted to sum up and maybe come to some closing remarks if you want. I mean, you can respond to that question, but
No, it's a great. I don't think there's any simple response to it. But I would say that continuing to have discussions like these and to really think about the rhetoric. I mean, I could have a longer discussion with you. I think it's a great idea. But I almost see I see a lot of steps before we can even kind of get there. I think we need to build, we need to get more people involved, more unions involved, for example, and put those questions to them. How are you going to deal with this? I mean, what can you do in your place of work if we actually had solidarity within your industry to change things? But you have to have people involved to do that. I just wanted to quickly see what Art had to say, and then we could conclude.
Well, I was just wondering what you should do with people who seem to know something's wrong but have completely garbled notions as to what it is. They start spouting off about going on the gold standard or the Illuminati and things like that. Should you just bother trying to educate them, or should you just leave them alone and focus on other things?
That's a great question. When I was in front of Bank of America last Friday, we had a guy go from demonstrator to demonstrator, asking him, why are we here? And Art's question is mine too.
You mean end the Fed,
yeah.
Bilderbergers? Yeah, I mean, I think that when the problems are so vast and complicated, of course people are going to have conspiratorial ideas. I think that's one thing that people are going to default to. I think that one of the ways that you can really have an impact is not by having a one-on-one conversation. But if we have unity as a movement, say we come up with a campaign plan. And like I said, our campaign plan isn't oh, we're going to accomplish this one goal. We're focused on this one thing. We think this is the center of all problems. No, we're not that foolish, right? We realize that the problems are deep. They're overlapping. There's contradictions. These are the multiple reasons that we're doing it. Yeah, the Fed may be a problem, but actually, we've had some prominent economists come in, we've had some discussions, and we realized that that's actually not the root issue. There's much more fundamental issues. And, if you want to learn about them, hang out a little bit, talk to people, be part of the movement. But, I agree. You can't really try to address everyone's individual concern, especially because we as a movement, I don't think that we all yet really understand and are kind of on the same page. Just because the questions are so complicated, like this question here. How do you take the abstract ideas and these big contradictions at the macro level, and the fact that we're actually weak in terms of movements relative to the other parts of the world? Those are all really thorny questions, not easy to answer. But, to me, it's right now it's about streamlining our organizing in such a way that we're trying to develop ourselves in a lot of different directions in different ways. Building people, developing our understanding, actually achieving certain goals, like stopping foreclosures, for example, etc. But just trying to remember that there's a whole constellation of things that we're trying to achieve, and it's definitely not about goals. It's definitely not about just some short-term victory necessarily. It's going to be a long struggle, and we're in the most difficult place to struggle. So we shouldn't be too hard on ourselves.
Well, I was just looking at that poster up there. Who owns the Federal Reserve? And it says Rothschild and Bank of England, Citibank. I'm not sure the Bank of England does, but the National Bank of Commerce and Chase, the First National. I was thinking, I've sort of been bringing coal to Newcastle. I mean, you're Occupy. You're part of the Occupy movement. You know what the central problem is, and my role is to reaffirm that and to maybe give a little bit more coherence to that. But what the central problem is? You've already focused it. It's this issue of 1%. It's a problem of class. It's a problem of concentrated power, and particularly economic power, and that's what you're going to address. And whatever actions you take are going to be strategically informed by that knowledge. And so that's why I think this movement is so important. And I don't think my role it was to teach this group. I think but we do need to reaffirm. We need to provide a bigger context, and then we need to realize, we have to do things strategically. We have to connect this theory or this general knowledge to particular strategic actions, like some of the things that people are trying to do in terms of taking over property that's going to be foreclosed and creation of land trusts. This is very radical. It's like the MST in Brazil. It would change, if that grew, it would change the whole discourse in this country. And that's really important. It gets people behind you. Just everyone in this country, well, I mean, I suppose there are a few people who never leave their video games and so on, but almost everybody in the country now knows what you mean when you say the 1%. And that is such a victory in a country that that never recognized inequality of wealth. And so just being part of that and remembering that you're part of that, that's what you have to hold on to and work with.
John, you said earlier about we need to perhaps act locally and change globally. I think we need to take it a little step further and say we need to act individually to change locally, and then act locally to change globally. I think we really need to realize that we're not in the 1%, and we need to join a movement like Occupy, and act individually to change locally, and then act locally in larger numbers to hopefully change globally. And I think that's the message I'm getting.
It's kind of like a Russian doll, isn't it?
Yeah. One in the center, exactly. Yeah.
All right, well.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.